Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. A ruler can command loudly at the center and still discover that power changes character once it travels beyond direct sight. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but how did rulers try to control officials who were acting on their behalf hundreds of miles away with no way to directly verify what was happening? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because the central challenge of ruling a large territory may be less about issuing the right orders than about designing structures that keep A. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. How did rulers try to control officials who were acting on their behalf hundreds of miles away with no way to directly verify what was happening? The pressure is immediate. The problem begins when distance gives local officials room to reinterpret orders, extract private benefit, protect local alliances, or simply serve the center less faithfully than reports might suggest. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between issuing authority and ensuring that delegated authority is used in the way the center actually intended. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is principal-agent theory, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. The distinction matters here. Principal-agent theory, how incentive misalignment between a distant ruler and local official can be narrowed through monitoring, rotation, competition, accountability, and autonomy. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. The central challenge of ruling a large territory may be less about issuing the right orders than about designing structures. The problem begins with distance. Distance creates delay, and delay creates room for discretion that cannot be watched continuously from the center. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That discretion is not automatically evil. Large territories need it because no ruler can micromanage every local decision in real time. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. But discretion changes incentives. A local official often knows more about the province than the center does, and that knowledge can be used for service, self-protection, or self-enrichment. So the first strategic question is informational. How does the center learn what the agent is actually doing, not what the agent wants reported upward? That is the mechanism. Multiple reporting channels help because they make it harder for one official to monopolize the story reaching the ruler. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Rotation is another tool. If an agent expects eventual transfer, it becomes harder to fuse personal local power completely with the office. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Competing jurisdictions can also help. When overlapping officials watch one another, the center gains more than one lens on local behavior. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Inspection matters conceptually as well, not because inspectors see everything, but because the possibility of being seen changes how boldly an agent can exploit opacity. That is the mechanism. Accountability must be credible to work. If punishment is never believable, rules become theater for distant audiences, not constraints on local action. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. At the same time, too much fear can be counterproductive. Terrified officials may hide problems, falsify calm, or avoid initiative just to survive audit. That is the mechanism. So the center has to align incentives, not merely threaten. It needs local success to remain visibly compatible with central loyalty. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That often means balancing reward, surveillance, and autonomy, not pretending one of those tools can solve the whole problem alone. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The deeper challenge is that rulers govern through people who inhabit two worlds at once, the center's expectations and the locality's pressures. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A strong design, therefore, does not assume purity. It assumes temptation, limited knowledge, and negotiation over what obedience looks like in practice. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The strategic win comes when an official sees service to the center as safer, more profitable, or more honorable than turning office into a private kingdom. That is the mechanism. A fair counterpoint is that some distant officials perform well less because incentives were beautifully designed and more because personal discipline, fear of shame, or local circumstance happen to favor compliance. The limitation is that principal-agent language is a modern analytical lens applied to pre-modern settings. So it clarifies incentives without erasing the cultural and moral worlds those officials inhabited. Oversight mechanisms can fail when the center multiplies offices without improving judgment, creating rivalry, concealment, and paperwork that still leaves local abuse untouched. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. There is also a rational exception in provinces where local conditions change so quickly that a rigidly obedient official may actually govern worse than one who departs from central instruction. Effective oversight is not identical to just rule. A well-monitored provincial system can still be coercive, extractive, or blind to local dignity. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful. When distant officials know they can be compared, rotated, checked, and replaced, private incentive drift is often more constrained than distance alone would predict. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Rulers managed distant officials more effectively when they treated oversight as a design problem, building layered reporting, credible accountability, and bounded autonomy that made local service to the center more attractive than private divergence. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking what the center can verify, what it must trust, and what it is accidentally rewarding. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, but distance ensures that every institution becomes partly an information problem. That question pushes attention back towards structure instead of mythology when we evaluate leadership under stress. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the issue becomes whether the local office serves the role or slowly absorbs the role into itself. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to one leader, one order, or one inspection. Durable oversight depends on repeated structure, not occasional outrage. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet ruling at distance always reveals whether the center understood incentive, information, and local pressure together. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether a center can extend authority far away without giving its own agents enough opacity to become semi-independent powers in practice. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.